Welcome to today's webinar on the end of the liberal world order. What comes next for the Baltic States? My name is Jörg Hackmann. I'm the current president of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies and a professor of history at Szczecin University in Poland. AABS started to organize webinars on current political and social topics on Ukraine and the Baltic region after the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine in spring 2022. Following the end of the Cold War, the US has been the main advocate for a rule-based liberal world order that champions democracy, free trade, and human rights. The three Baltic states eagerly signed on. They could successfully obtain EU and NATO membership in 2004 and have benefited from the system. But this world order is no more. With Donald Trump's 2025 return to power, the US will no longer be the advocate it once was. Other powers, chiefly Russia and China, welcome this change and seek to reshape the international system in accordance with their own views of the world and imperial interests. What do these changes mean for the Baltic states and their neighbors? How will the American retreat from defending liberal values affect European and Baltic security? What actions can the Baltic states take to ensure the prosperity and freedom they have enjoyed for the last few decades? These and other questions will be tackled by our distinguished panelists. Volodymyr Dubovyk is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and director of the Center for International Studies, Odessa I, Mechnikov National University, Ukraine. Aleksandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova is head of the Center for Chinese Studies at Riga Stradiņš University in Latvia and head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. Andres Kasekamp is the Elmar Tampel Chair of Estonian Studies and Professor of History at the University of Toronto. The webinar will be moderated by Charles Shapiro, former United States ambassador to Venezuela. Please note that chat is disabled. We welcome your question via the Q&A button. Now I hand over to Charles Shapiro, the moderator of today's webinar.
Good. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with a group of really terrific panelists who are literally around the world right now. I'm one of those guys who hopes we're not at the end of the liberal world order, which has brought so much prosperity and peace to the industrialized world and including to the Baltics. I've got a lot to learn because I'm the only one on here who is not an expert in the Baltics. And at this point, I think I'm going to turn this over to our panelists. And I believe Volodymyr is going to start. So Volodymyr, can you talk about the American retreat from defending liberal values affecting Ukraine and European and Baltic security?
Well, yeah, thank you. First of all, many thanks for inviting me to participate in this event. This is very interesting event. Obviously, it's not the first by far event that I've taken part with Association for the Baltic Studies. It's always a pleasure to come back and be invited to speak at yet another event. In recent years, in terms of taking care of its own security, one way to do it, of course, was to deepen cooperation and collaboration with many other players in the region, deepening this ties in the region and including producing more weapons and stuff like that. Second thing, obviously, is that staying very much on the guard against any sort of Russian endeavors in the region, so to speak, including many that still qualify maybe by hybrid, but not necessarily, because if you're cutting the link and the cables on the bottom of the sea, that's a very thin line, I would say, dividing this from non-military and therefore kind of hybrid to military, because those cables are also needed, for defense cooperation. In terms of U.S. role in the region, it's always been huge, even though I think the many countries in the region have been able to construct viable defense security community here, even without very strong and robust and massive American support. But at the same time, U.S. support is important in many parts of the world, and this one an exception. Clearly, the recent 3 months of the current administration has where people have been depending and still depend on U.S. support to a large extent, and very much worry about all these things that happen in Washington and don't happen in Washington, that need to be happening but not happening in Washington, and many that we would rather see not happening, but they're happening. So anyway, I suppose that the formal reorientation, ideological, and also strategic, and also in terms of potential withdrawal of American troops, maybe from the region, this is going to be harmful, and this is going to be seen as an invitation for Russia, but not only Russia, because of course we're also going to talk about China today, but China, of course, is going to play a role of the soft power in many ways, while Russia can definitely play a role of hard power and aggressive power at that. And therefore, the whole discussion about valuing and not valuing the Chapter 5 of the Washington Treaty, the whole discussion whether NATO should be intact or not, what about all these various groups that have been formed within the alliance, or with the alliance heavy participation for us in Ukraine, for instance, the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, what going to happen to it? They've been trying to recalibrate it away from U.S. leadership, anticipating probable return of Trump to the White House, and therefore, right now, the group continues to exist, but not led by U.S. Like it was for 3 years. And the current Secretary of Defense, of course, Mr. Hackstead, preferred not to take part in person in the first meeting, but he was there online, and then we'll see how long he will be a Secretary of Defense in general, but that's a separate subject. So anyhow, I think this is all wrong messages to the people who are very pro-American, of course, who've been very much valuing American participation in the security of the region, and also a wrong message, or the message which is anticipated happily by people who are willing maybe to move into this security zone, being Russia. And now we are seeing that Russia is also, of course, trying to recover some of their lost, capabilities in the region. We're hearing news that they near the Finnish border with Finland, and that's why it's still very important for everyone, not just for Ukraine, to understand and see where it's going with the Russia-Ukraine war, with Russia's war in Ukraine, how it's going to end, when it's going to end, at what conditions, what context, because if it ends on the favorable conditions, to Russia, then of course Russia will be very much emboldened, and they'll be able to recover and produce more weapons and maybe mobilize more people, and therefore the entire region of the Baltic and the entire region of the Greater East. If, on the contrary, Russia is not capable of carrying away much of the loot and victories away from this war, that would be a better chance for the countries in the region to think together about more viable and more protectable security, if you like. Thank you.
You're in Japan now, and you've been following China very, very carefully. Can you please explain to us what's up with the Chinese charm offensive in Europe? Is it working? Europeans offended by the United States, feeling let down by the United States? Are they turning to China? How do you see this proceeding?
Yes, this is indeed the right time to ask this question. Thank you, Charles, because, there is a theory that's being floated around that the EU now will kind of pivot. The name of our seminar, The End of the Liberal World Order, I would add a question mark here, of course, and then this from the Chinese perspective, and sometimes we also see it from colleagues in Europe, is the idea that Europe will sort of de-risk from China or reverse de-risking from China under the current threats to the liberal world order. What do we know so far? Well, we know that the EU-China summit will happen, or So it would seem in July in Beijing, Xi Jinping said he will not be going to Europe. So that's a little bit of a sign that Europe is ready to come to him, reportedly. But the big question, of course, is will China facilitate this pivot? Will they try to lure Europe by becoming a constructive partner, by maybe stepping away from some of the things that had been an issue? Or will they see this as a moment of European weakness and decide, oh, we need to push our agenda? We don't know that. But even though we don't know that, I think it's important to remind ourselves that we have to continue to use these events to make several European points clear, including the one that the main point is that European grievances with China do not stem from a US agenda. They stem from European, domestic, real issues, real problems. And of course, Russian war in Ukraine and China's position, which is in support to an extent, of course, but still is not against Russia's war in Ukraine, let's say, is a matter of prime importance to the EU. And we're looking forward to our Estonian Baltic representative, Kai Kallas, to do that, right? And the second thing is that it's not just about the values of European security, it's also about the economy, that the tariffs on the Chinese EVs do come from a European context, not because somebody from Washington called and said, hey, why don't you impose some tariffs now? So, and I think it's also very important to remember that this charm offensive may happen indeed in a charming way with a carrot, or it can carry a stick. But China is also not in a great place right now, because this challenge to the liberal world order from a market perspective is not a moment of strength for China. So I think whatever negotiations are good, summit is a good thing. Let's keep talking. Let's get the Baltic voice out there. We're in a good position to do that. But let's remember these 3 points.
Thank you, Una. I appreciate it. Andres, I'm going to turn to you. You're the Canada expert in the group. So I have a lot of questions from you as we move forward. So tell us about the viewpoint from Canada and Trump threatening its allies, threatening NATO allies, and what you expect to come out of the meeting between Prime Minister Carney and President Trump in the Oval Office tomorrow.
Well, actually, of course, I'm the Estonian expert who happens to be in Canada, and I used to teach in Estonia, and people in Canada sort of assume that I left Estonia 7 years ago because I realized that the threat from Putin was genuine towards the Baltic States. But that's like from the now the Canadian perspective, Trump threatening to annex Canada is perhaps more of an immediate threat than Putin towards the Baltic states. Yes, there's the meeting between Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who won his election last week, mainly because of Trump's threats towards Canada. The Conservatives, who were seen to be too close to MAGA, were ahead by 20% in December, and they managed to lose. So a remarkable turnaround, which of course also has to do with Justin Trudeau resigning, who'd been in power for way too long, but mainly because of an upswing in Canadian patriotism in response to Trump's threats, using a lot of the same language that Putin uses towards Ukraine, calling Canada not a real country, the border being an artificial line, calling the Prime Minister the governor, and of course Canada the 51st state. All of this was, well, very disrespectful, to say the least. So Canadians are pretty outraged, and it'll be very interesting to see what sort of language Trump uses tomorrow when he meets Prime Minister Carney, who was the only non-Brit who was the president or the governor of the Bank of England during the Brexit crisis as well. So he's been in lots of sticky situations before, so I hope he's able to, but he's not a career politician, so I hope he's able to handle Trump tomorrow. But the bigger lesson for the international system and also for the Baltic states and Ukraine, of course, is the unraveling of the international system. If might makes right, and if neighbors can just bully neighbors who they already have good treaty relations with, and these treaties mean nothing, then all of us are in danger. Of course, Canada and Mexico have this three-party free trade agreement with the United States, which Trump, in his first term, insisted on renegotiating to the US's favor. And he called it the best deal ever in 2018 when he signed it. And now, a month or so ago, he said that the American leaders who signed the trade deals with Canada must be idiots. So it's going to be a hard sell to try to convince. Let me say them. Things are not getting better with Trump, in the sense that we're talking about the international system. But an America that takes over Canada against the will of the Canadian people will not be a democracy anymore. I mean, America's going rapidly down this path of the end of rule of law, in a democracy like an illiberal democracy like Hungary. And if Canada is taken over, it won't be the 51st state. It'll be an occupied territory like Puerto Rico. So my assessment is quite grim. But of course, Canadians are not going to let that happen. And then the Prime Minister will make that clear tomorrow to Trump. We'll see what his reaction is.
Thank you very much. That was an interesting insight. And it is interesting to see the United States having switched roles to being the threat is from the United States, not from Russia. What actions, this is for all of you, what actions can the Baltic states take to ensure the prosperity and freedom they've enjoyed over the past 2 decades?
Okay, then I think I already mentioned some of it. I think that working together is very important. Investing into defense and better preparedness, obviously. And then, of course, trying to work with other countries within NATO and with the US even now, with current administration, trying to convince them not to withdraw, not to minimize their presence in the region, military presence in the region, but on the contrary, to actually provide the assistance. We don't know yet whether this ideas of maybe minimizing US military presence in Europe or reducing it, cutting it, which is going back to what Trump tried to do and actually authorize that by the very end of his first term, 4 years. There was not enough time to actually do it, and then Biden came to power. So, and they were moved around in some other places in Europe, including some bizarre ideas about being moved to Hungary, for instance. But he might not do it. We'll see, and we'll see what happens with the U.S. presence. But other countries should pick up more of the assistance and more of the role, including Germany, which is appearing to be in the mood with the new government, which is about to be running the country, running the show, understanding that expectations from Germany are growing, including in the Baltic region, and basically Germany is also a Baltic country. And that's why we now need to understand what Germany can offer. Invest in all of it, as always, which is a strong feature for the countries of the Baltic region, always been. Estonia, of course, was one of the first major targets of a major attack, cyber attack, many years ago, and ever since, not just Estonia, but many other countries in the region been paying very serious attention to the cybersecurity, various cyber threats, and leading in terms of trying to react to what Russia is doing right now with provocations, with airplanes flying where they're not supposed to fly, or where there are cables being cut. Whether it's working with some ethnic Russian population in certain countries and using their presence in those countries to destabilize them. But the Baltic republics, I mean, the Baltic countries, of course, they have managed to get a lot of experience. So just double down on that, really, and deepen sharing of knowledge and working with Ukraine, because Ukraine can actually teach a lot on many of those issues to other countries who are willing to find out, how to better prepare themselves. So there is no big secret here. I mean, obviously, there is a difference between, let's say, three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania on one hand, and then Ukraine and another. Russia controls currently about 20% of Ukraine's territory, but Ukraine still controls 80, which means we control 80. So Ukraine has strategic depth. Not only Russia has strategic depth that we knew for many decades, really, even in times of the Cold War, but Ukraine has some strategic depth. Well, three Baltic countries I've mentioned, they don't. Therefore, their situation is more peculiar. And of course, one way to continue to help themselves is to continue to help Ukraine, and that's been clear to them, from day one of the massive Russian invasion, and that's the way forward. Help Ukraine with whatever you can. If you look at the share of GDP, for instance, that's being spent on helping Ukraine, that's absolutely astronomical numbers in those three countries, for instance. And so that's because not only people are remembering what happened to their parents and grandparents at one point of time who suffered from Russian and Soviet leadership, but also people understand, being outraged of what Russia is doing, but also understanding this all through the prism of their own security. So therefore, the bet on Ukraine, the help to Ukraine is not really even a choice. It's more of a that we need to do it, and they need to do it, and they need to help Ukraine, and they're helping Ukraine, and that's been very much appreciated in Ukraine. So the better Ukraine is prepared to continue to fight Russian aggression, the smaller the chances that Russia will be emboldened enough, to attack them. That's a very simple logic. Secretary of Defense Austin, in a previous administration, he once said, and he was, attacked by various people in the White House for saying that, even though he was very true kind of remark, that the goal for US, for instance, is to weaken Russia to the extent that it ceases to be a threat to Ukraine and other countries in the region. So that's a goal for everyone. That should be a goal for everyone. Weaker Russia means lesser of a chance of it becoming coming with their tanks and missiles on your own door.
That's great. Thank you. We have the first. I'm sorry. I'm going to. We've got a first audience question and that's how could security and cooperation be impacted by the rise of far-right and ultra-nationalist politicians on NATO's eastern flank? Saw the election in Romania this weekend, which is really quite frightening. So, Una, do you want to take that on?
I will kind of segue from the previous question to this one. Sure, I'm not much of a specialist when it comes to Romanian politics, although we, of course, are following what is happening. But I do want to say that in the Baltic states, very important is about fostering internal resilience through solidarity with your neighbors. This way, our populations remember that it is not us nationalists versus somebody else who's trying to somehow, undermine us. No. And I think Baltic solidarity is very important. That is one thing that the Baltic states have, which is unique globally, I can say, in that, even 2 days ago, we had the renewed Independence Day, our national day, May 4th. And when you see these videos, what flags do you see there in the crowd? You see Estonian flags, you see Lithuanian flags, you see Ukrainian flags. So I think it's very important to let our population know that the issues that they're facing, and by the way, a lot of these far-right politicians are driven by bread and butter issues, right? Their popularity is driven by, it's not necessarily ideology. It's just the fact that, this guy's going to make everything so much better, and he's not going to let any of those, immigrants whom I don't like into the country and stuff like that. So we have to remind people that those issues are not uniquely their own. And we also need to remind them, and we need to demonstrate that we as countries, even though we're small, but we are involved. We're not one issue states. We're involved on issues that matter to our partners. Well, Latvia is hopefully going to be elected as a non-perm, is going to finally get its day in the sunshine as a non-permanent member of the UN. And I hope that my country uses this for this exact purpose, to show that we are one with our partners and with other countries, and that it's not that these issues that we're facing, they are in fact translatable. I don't have any better recipes, and I do understand that, of course, a resilient society, on one hand, sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that for a society to be resilient, it has to be very similar, right? But I think that in differences lies the answer. So the fact that we have a society with its differences doesn't mean that it has to be fragmented. So there can be unity in differences.
Okay, I'll try to answer both the question from the public and Charles' previous question. Is there some relationship between the two? First of all, of course, about how the Baltic states can be successful. I mean, as Volodymyr alluded to already, I mean, the best thing that can happen for the Baltic states and for Europe and the West in general would be to defeat Russia on the battlefield in Ukraine. And all our efforts should be focused on that. And unfortunately, the US has abandoned ship on this, which means that the Europeans have to step up. As probably most of the listeners know here, Estonia has been the #1 contributor per capita, that is proportionally, to Ukraine right from the beginning. Denmark is now catching up, and Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are a little bit behind. But they far exceed what the US has given proportionally as part of their GDP. And Americans, of course, really aren't aware of that. They've fallen for this in sort of absolute numbers. Of course, the Americans have given much more. But as a percentage, meaning the actual sacrifice of taxpayers, it's much greater in Europe than it is in the US. Sure, these days, say the Spaniards or some other Western and Southern Europeans aren't carrying their weight, but that's another matter. And all the 3 Baltic states, beginning with Estonia, but I believe Latvia and Lithuania as well, they're up at 3%, which is above the 2% NATO spending on defense of their GDP. And Trump suggested that everyone goes up to 5. The US, by the way, only spends 3, so that would far exceed what the US is willing to do. The US, I understand, is planning to actually cut its defense budget. But the Baltic governments all welcome this idea of going up to 5%, and of course would love to see other Europeans do the same. The Estonian government is going forward with this. And the Baltic states, on paper, shouldn't have anything to worry about, right? Because Trump already a long time ago said that those NATO member states that don't pay enough, the Russians let them do what they want. But, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania can turn to Washington and say, well, we spend 5%. You've got to defend us, right? But the problem is it's not the numbers, it's the credibility of Article 5, right? If no matter what you spend, if the Kremlin doesn't believe that the US is going to actually come to the military aid of these countries, then that's not going to make much of a difference. But now, connecting to the question from the audience, ramping up defense spending comes at a great cost to other things, right? Social programs, health, education, culture, whatever. And I think you can hear grumblings in Baltic society, as you can everywhere elsewhere in Europe, that how long can we keep this up? And so there is generally thought to be a correlation between sort of dissatisfaction with economic prospects and higher living costs and the rise of the populist radical right. After all, the recent US election was supposedly decided on the cost of eggs, of all things. But the Balts are paying for their energy and everything else. The costs have gone up, are much harsher than anything those fickle American voters have experienced. But they realize the threat is existential from Russia, so they're They're not going to sacrifice their security for, I think, some populist appeals.
Yeah, that's key. Volodymyr has his hand raised. You want to add something here, Volodymyr?
Yes, just two fingers really, not much. But there is a major contradiction there in the message coming from Washington to Europe now. On the one hand, they're saying you have to spend more money on defense and stop being freeloaders and free riders and everything like that. We can't pay for your security anymore. But on the other hand, when Europe is actually talking about that and trying to do that and getting their act together, trying to spend more and coordinate, then Americans are not happy. Like why Europe is even having their own position on the Russia-Ukraine war. We are negotiating Russia-Ukraine war. What's there for Europe to do? We would negotiate it. They say in Washington, we would sign a nice treaty with Putin. Everyone will be happy, and then Europe will have to implement it. To carry it all out, maybe send peacekeepers. We don't know. We don't care. Maybe provide some security assistance and assurances and guarantees to Ukraine. We would be part of that. But the general treaty, the big treaty between Washington and Moscow is going to be so nice and beautiful. So why are Europeans even giving money to Ukraine? We know now that there've been some communication from Washington to certain European capitals, like, why are you continuing to give money to Ukraine to buy weapons or sending weapons to Ukraine? This is undermining our peace effort, So there is a huge contradiction right here. Like previously, the message was under various administrations, including Obama and Biden. By the way, Obama was the first one who actually set the milestones for the Europeans and how much they have to spend eventually on their defense. But then on the other hand, like when Europe is trying to do exactly that and try to take care of their security, understanding that Ukraine's security is part of European security. So therefore, to facilitate their own security, they need to help Ukraine. Then people in Washington are suddenly not happy. So that was my remark. It's very confusing now what Washington actually wants Europe to do.
That seems pretty clear. There's an audience question regarding J.D. Vance, the American Vice President's speech at the Munich Security Conference. He asserted that the threat to Europe is coming from within, as Europe is abandoning its values. What's the perception of that from the Baltics? Una, is Europe abandoning its values?
I would say no, but of course, I think that he refers to free speech and he uses quite freely. That did not mean to, you did no pun intended, or how do you call it? But he does apply it selectively too. And what Europe still has, not all of Europe, but most European countries, is the division of power, is a strong judiciary. And I am not a lawyer. I do not know how to qualify the decision when it comes to Georgescu's taking off to Georgescu out of the run for president or his win in Romania. I don't know how to qualify AfD being called an extremist organization. It certainly matches my hunch, let's say the least. But I do feel that the arguments there are strong, and the judiciary is there, and the media is there. And of course, also the executive and the legislature do not agree. So I would say that this is very good proof of the fact that we have a division of powers in Europe. And yes, sometimes it happens slowly. It doesn't happen in Doge style or in J.D. Vance style. So of course, apparently, the first thing that I asked the people who were in the room in Munich is, did he get any claps? And apparently, not very many.
That seems pretty clear.
I would say what J.D. Vance is doing would be classified as foreign interference in European internal affairs. But I mean, I think it was mostly for his own domestic audience, right? It's and of course he has a fan club in Europe. We mentioned Romania earlier, but Viktor Orban and his government in Hungary has been a path breaker for many years, right? Remember, Tucker Carlson went to Budapest several years ago to interview Orban. So Project 2025 is actually learning something from European experience. And it's Orban in Hungary who has been talking about going back to old European values. In other words, turning back the clock in a sort of populist fashion and going against sort of what the European Commission has been doing. So there is probably, maybe 20% of the European population roughly who would be kind of receptive to this sort of message. That some things have gone too far in Europe, and there's sort of dissatisfaction. But I don't think Europeans are sort of very ready to kind of welcome sort of American prescriptions of how to fix things. I mean, it was actually another. Volodymyr was talking about contradictions earlier, and I think it's a really stark contradiction that J.D. Vance and Elon Musk were praising the AfD, the German far-right party, because they want to undermine the European Union, which is also their goal. But they totally don't realize that, well, the AfD, as a German ultranationalist party, they're not only anti-EU, they've always been anti-American as well. And that, they just like that they're anti-immigrant and they're anti-EU, and they forget about the fact that they're a genuinely anti-American party to the core. That's very strong, and anti-Americanism, both on the left and the right in Europe.
Volodymyr, let me ask you a Ukrainian question.
Okay.
President Zelensky had a terrible meeting in the White House with President Trump. It's been, what, months now? But yet, since then, it seems like perhaps Zelensky's a better negotiator than Trump, no? That the minerals agreement that was signed was much better than what we had seen a month ago. Mm-hmm. The United States has resumed providing military equipment to Ukraine. I have not been able to keep up with all the versions of the peace deal that's being negotiated, but certainly it appears that perhaps Trump has a more realistic view of Putin and what Putin is up to. Is that fair? Am I characterizing this correctly, or no?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's a big perhaps. I'm not believing that Trump is really shifting or adjusting his position on the subject. I don't think he is reversing his position. I am one of those Ukrainian experts who never had any positive anticipations about Trump returning to the White House for the sake of Ukraine and in terms of its impact on Ukraine's fate. There have been quite a few Ukrainians who've been thinking that maybe Biden, with his spoon feeding of Ukraine, going away, and Trump returning with his disruptive and predictable nature would be a better thing for Ukraine. But I never thought that way, and I think the recent 3 months kind of validated. Things might still have changed, and I always, when I talk to Ukrainian media, for instance, or Ukrainian audience, I say I would like to be mistaken, and that Trump would suddenly turn around and say, oh, yeah, here's new sanctions on Russia, and here's new weapons for you, Ukraine. But that's probably not going to happen. So can Zelensky still communicate? He can, and he can better communicate, I think, within 15 minutes of direct talking to Trump in a San Pietro in Rome than he was in the White House. Whether it was a mistake for Zelensky to talk back to Trump on February 28th meeting in the Oval Office, that's an open question, and Ukrainians are divided on that. What they're not divided on, that Zelensky had to talk about Ukraine's core issues like security assistance, weapons provision and security guarantees and other things. But whether he was humiliated, for sure, and that's what Trump has done. By attacking Zelensky, he's increased his popularity within Ukraine, which was going down steadily, and his ratings are now up, and the trust to Zelensky is higher than ever in the recent 3 years, really. in Ukraine, and look what he's doing to other countries, like what he did to Canadian situation, what he did other day to the Australian elections. What he's doing to AfD. Some people are still saying, well, probably it's hard to quantify, but maybe Musk and Vance interfering on behalf of AfD actually cost them some votes, and they could have got even better results in the recent German elections. But unfortunately, even Secretary Rubio joined the chorus the other day, attacking Germany on that, and German foreign ministry, of course, had to react. That's very unfortunate. That's very unfortunate because Germany, has its constitution, its laws, and they need to adhere to their laws. Of course, it's a unique situation when one of the most powerful political forces is basically violating so many, regulations. That's a problem, but that's quite different. That's what Europeans used to live under, the situation with respect to the law. And unlike the leader of certain Western country who being asked the other day whether he has to uphold the constitution, he said, "I don't know." So that's quite different. But in Germany, of course, that's not possible that you would hear it from chancellor or president or a certain minister that he doesn't have to obey laws. But going back to Ukraine, I think Zelensky still retains the power of a pretty good communicator, even though he's really tired. He is often hitting the wall. He's not received in the same way like it was 3 years ago, as really a messiah, as a superhero, something like that. So that's gone, but he still retains some of it. And that's why, yes, I think the minerals deal that we have signed, it's not something that we needed, in my own opinion. It's something which Trump needed much more than Ukraine. And going forward, it's hard even to understand how it's going to work out down the road. But at the same time, if Trump wanted it, okay, here we go, we can sign it. And indeed, like you said, Charles, in the recent weeks, the Ukrainian side has done a lot of work on improving the text of this framework agreement that we have recently signed. Yeah.
Let me remind the audience, please submit questions using the Q&A function. If you move your cursor to the bottom of the screen, you'll see it there. Please do that. I have a question. I'm not sure if this is for Andres or Una. It's something that I think Americans don't know. How important was the fact that the United States never recognized de jure the Soviet occupation of the three Baltic nations? How important was that for you in the early 90s as the Baltics tried to achieve independence once again? And obviously, that's got real implications for Ukraine and Crimea.
Well, I can take that as the historian, even though it would be Una's turn to go. But let me plug a book by not our Una, but Una Bergmane, who's written about the politics of uncertainty, the United States and the collapse of the USSR and the Baltic question, where this idea, the doctrine of non-recognition of annexation by the US, and which was adopted by other countries, what a crucial role it played. And it seemed, of course, like a hopeless case. So, I mean, there was a big editorial in the New York Times about a week ago, reiterating exactly that Baltic case and why it would be so important to apply the same logic to Crimea and all other territories occupied by Russia in Ukraine. That sure, if you make a ceasefire, that there can be a de facto arrangement, but to recognize de jure. And that's such a core fundamental principle of the international order, which was established after the Second World War, that you don't move borders by force. And so recognizing Crimea as legally occupied by Russia would have such knock-on effects to the rest of the world. And it would sort of open the floodgates for aggression in all corners of the world. So it's just mind-boggling that anyone on the side of the United States, which came up with this non-recognition of annexation policy in the first place back in 1940, applying it to the Soviet annexation of the Baltic states in the summer of 1940, this would be disastrous for everyone, but it'd be warmly welcomed by the Kremlin.
Yeah, Mr. Witkoff, Trump's special envoy for the Ukraine war, doesn't seem to have read any history and certainly doesn't know this. Maybe you can send him a copy of the book. Una, I have a question to you from the audience. How is the the American and European reaction to what's going on in Ukraine, how is that impacting China in its own expansionist aims in the South China Sea and certainly towards Taiwan?
Yes, that's a great question. Certainly immediately after February 24th, 2022, that was the second thought for everyone. The first thought, of course, was with Ukraine, and the second thought was, is Taiwan next? What is going to happen? Is China going to take this playbook? Is it learning? Well, we've been 3.5 years into this war, into this full-scale war, and we see that China has amped up the hybrid pressures on Taiwan. We see, flyovers, drills, blockades, information manipulation and information suppression, all of these instruments, but they do fall short of preparing a kinetic invasion, hopefully. And in fact, the public opinion in Taiwan also remains sort of divided on. My colleagues have conducted wonderful research on the willingness to defend, comparing the Baltic states, the opinions in the Baltic states and the public opinions in Taiwan, and the ones in Taiwan indeed are lower, the willingness to defend in case of an armed invasion. So I guess the threat does not seem as imminent for a huge part of population in that sense. So I think what we are seeing is China taking opportunities in its vicinity. I think what's happening with India is also very interesting to watch. In its vicinity, in not in a kinetic, not in a 20th century way, but in a hybrid, classic security / economic security kind of way. China is very aware of the risks this brings because it understands that as Taiwan sees semiconductors as the main guarantor in a lot of ways of its sovereignty, and then the fact that there is that this would indeed keep and produce support for Taiwan internationally, not just for values, not just for anything else, but also for this. So China is trying to amp up its own capabilities in that respect. But I think the first scare is over. The first scare that we had in 2022 is over. But China certainly has learned a lesson. So maybe this comparison between Taiwan and Ukraine is not fully out of place, because the first lesson is something that's good for us. It's good news for us. China saw how quickly the West reacted. And we do like to, criticize ourselves, but we did see that this reaction, it didn't come as quickly as we anticipated, but it was certainly there, and it came stronger than China had anticipated, than Russia had anticipated. So in times of crisis, NATO and the wider community have a position and have a standing. That was one thing. So that is a deterrent. But there is also an enabling factor there. And the enabling factor there was that there were so many countries who said, this is not our problem really, or that both sides are right, or that both sides are wrong. It's too complicated, and Russia has a point. So China also understood that it's very important, before you do anything, is to gather support within the UN, within the multilateral platforms, either existing platforms or those of China's making, to create that support. And we see that now, perhaps in a very justified way, I would say, pushing against what the US has been doing to China. China is kind of galvanizing those networks of support against the United States, saying that, we do not bend, and you should not bend to this pressure. using the countries. And we say global South, but it's more than that, and it's not just the global South. And some countries in the global South do not agree with this, but just kind of the global majority, the G77, in fact, and is using these networks. And that is something that remains to be seen in the future, whether or not, if China decides to go for a full-scale scenario, it will have these networks to fall back on.
That's great. And we've got an audience question here directed to Volodymyr. Coming back to Russia and hard security, do you see a possibility for a stronger deterrent in the Baltic Sea? Is Baltic sentry sufficient? And if you could just start, just one sentence, what is Baltic sentry for those of us who might not know?
Yeah, I would actually rather leave that question to my colleagues who do more work on the Baltic security than myself. I can see some other questions here, but on the previous question, I also would like to add very quickly that, of course, it's very interesting how the future of Crimea, for instance, or Ukraine's territorial integrity is tied historically, even contextually, in terms of international law and American view of the region. It was no mistake that in 2018, when Mike Pompeo, at that point of time, Secretary of the State, of course, in the previous Trump administration, signed the Crimean Declaration. Very clear, very short document, but he found it needful to mention the Sumner Wells Declaration from 1940. So that is very interesting as an example that America would never recognize Crimea. And of course, he knew what he was talking about, but people in the region know even better what is Russian imperialism. And it reminds me of Viktor Brzezinski, for instance, who said in the early 1990s that without Ukraine under Russian control, Russia has a decent chance of becoming a normal, civilized country, a democratic one. But with Ukraine fully or even partially under Russian control, it automatically becomes an empire. That is something that, of course, neither of those two great real estate titans from Manhattan, who are now running, U.S.-Russian policy, can understand or even care enough about it. But people did, and Ukrainians in America, of course, they also understood. It reminded me of the great Ukrainian-American Lev Dobryansky, who was a key figure an architect of the captive nations legislation under Dwight Eisenhower administration in terms of non-recognizing three Baltic countries being part of Russian Soviet Union at that point of time, of course. And he's being Ukrainian American. I think he clearly understood how is this relevant, very much relevant to Ukraine's fate, and one day Ukraine's chance to become a free country and have its own territorial integrity.
Excellent. Andres, you want to take a crack at Baltic Sentry and security in the Baltic?
Baltic Sentry is the NATO term for this new operation, which is a response to the severing of the undersea cables. So NATO had to respond in some way, and it's showing that it's paying attention and it's coordinating, and it's not simply a Baltic problem, but it's a problem for the whole alliance. Obviously, all these mysterious accidents over the past 2 years with these cables, they kept getting more severe until, first of all, the Finns and then the Swedes and the Estonians intervened. And it's a classic question that, so what do you do with a bully, or what do you do in these hybrid operations if you hope it kind of goes away, then it'll probably encourage the aggressor to do more. So you have to show some determination. Whether this will be enough is I think an open question. And of course, the Russians have proved adept that once one avenue of sort of hybrid operations has been closed down, they're very adept at finding a new avenue to disrupt where we're weak and vulnerable and we haven't thought about it before. So I think that's Baltic Sentry is a nice gesture, but it's just a reaction to something that caught us off guard, and there'll be new things down the pipeline.
I appreciate that. And I think that's absolutely accurate. So we've got 2 minutes left. And I don't know how to sum up this wide-ranging discussion that we've had, except to say it's been super interesting. Una, I'm going to give you the last word here. How can the Baltic states contribute to the emerging world order?
I think we really need to take part in the conversation about what the European open strategic autonomy will look like. This is the time now when that conversation is happening. We will not be able to contribute to the emerging global world order as 3 Baltic states, no matter how much solidarity is there. But we are certainly, our strength is the fact that we are part of a bigger organism, which has also coincidentally woken up to the new reality. And yes, in 2017, when during the French leadership and President Emmanuel Macron, when he started talking about this, we were reluctant to get on board because for us it was the doubling of the American function, essentially, especially in security in Europe. But today, when we see, and coming back to the topic of our seminar, we see these major changes taking place. It is up to us to shape this conversation about research security, about economic security, but most importantly, and this is maybe where we see things differently, because for many Europeans, open strategic autonomy is primarily about economic security. For us, real hard security is just as important, and we need to continue to make that voice heard.
Thank you. That's a great summary and a great way to end exactly at 1 o'clock Eastern time. So we've got this to an hour. I want to thank the audience for sticking with us for a full hour. A few dropped off, as always happens, but I think that's a tribute to our panelists and the great conversation we've had. And I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies for organizing and sponsoring this program. And so Volodymyr, Andres, Una, thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you all.